Here you are, gentlemen.
Thank you, ma'am. Looks delicious. Yeah, smells amazing.
Enjoy.
Kind old lady shelters. 15 Hells Angels during a snowstorm. Next day, 100 bikes line up at her door. The wind howled through the mountain pass as Margaret Henderson peered through her frost-covered window into the blinding whiteness beyond. At 73 years old, she'd seen plenty of Colorado snowstorms, but this one was different. The Weather Service had called it a once-in-a-decade blizzard, and from what she could see, they weren't exaggerating. Margaret lived alone in a sprawling farmhouse that had belonged to her family for 3 generations. Her late husband, Robert, had passed 5 years ago, and her children had long since moved to warmer climates, constantly urging her to do the same. But this was her home, filled with memories and the kind of stubborn roots that don't transplant well. She was preparing her evening tea when she heard the rumble. At first she thought it was thunder, which would have been unusual in a snowstorm. But as the sound grew closer, she recognized it as motorcycles, multiple motorcycles. Through the increasingly opaque curtain of snow she could make out headlights, moving slowly, struggling against the storm. Margaret grabbed her heavy coat and made her way to the front porch. What she saw would have frightened most people. 15 massive motorcycles were pulling into her long driveway, their riders dressed in leather jackets adorned with the unmistakable patches of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. These were big men, covered in snow, their bikes weaving dangerously on the increasingly treacherous road. The lead rider killed his engine and removed his helmet, revealing a grizzled face framed by a salt and pepper beard. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I know how this looks, but we're in serious trouble. We got caught in this storm coming back from a charity run in Denver. The highway's completely shut down and we can't see more than a few feet ahead. Is there any chance at all, we could wait out the worst of this storm somewhere on your property? We'll stay in your barn, your garage, anywhere." Margaret studied the group. Yes, they looked intimidating. Yes, her daughter would have a heart attack if she knew, but she also saw something else. She saw 15 human beings in genuine danger, cold and at the mercy of a brutal storm that showed no signs of letting up. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "You'll come inside where it's warm. There's no heat in the barn, and I won't have anyone freezing to death on my property." The bikers exchanged glances of disbelief. The leader, who introduced himself as Big Joe, tried to protest. "Ma'am, that's incredibly kind, but there are 15 of us. We couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will," Margaret interrupted with the kind of authority that only a woman who'd raised 3 rowdy boys could muster. "Now get those bikes covered as best you can and get inside before you all turn into popsicles." What followed was one of the most unusual evenings of Margaret Henderson's life. 15 Hells Angels, who looked like they could tear apart a bar without breaking a sweat, filed into her home like obedient schoolchildren, stomping snow off their boots and apologizing for the puddles they were making. Margaret immediately went into grandmother mode. She pulled out every blanket she owned, started brewing industrial quantities of coffee, and began raiding her freezer. "I hope you boys like pot roast," she called from the kitchen. "I've got 3 in here that I've been meaning to cook." As the storm raged outside, something remarkable happened inside. The bikers, initially awkward and careful not to touch anything, began to relax. They helped Margaret in the kitchen, set up the dining room table, and shared stories. Big Joe, it turned out, was a veteran who'd served in Vietnam. Tiny, who was anything but tiny, was a father of 4 who worked as a mechanic. Spider, whose nickname came from a large tattoo rather than any physical resemblance, was putting himself through nursing school. Margaret learned that they'd been returning from a toy drive for children's hospitals, their saddlebags full of donations they'd collected. These supposedly terrifying men spent their free time raising money for sick kids, supporting veterans, and volunteering at homeless shelters. As the night wore on, they taught her to play poker. She won $17, and she taught some of them how to properly darn socks, a skill their mothers had apparently neglected. They laughed, they swapped stories of lost loves and wild adventures, and they treated Margaret's home with the kind of respect usually reserved for a sacred space. Around midnight, when the storm finally began to subside, Big Joe gathered his crew. "We've imposed on your hospitality long enough, ma'am. We can't thank you enough for what you've done tonight. You literally saved our lives. Margaret waved off the thanks. "You boys ride safe now, and Joe, you make sure those toys get to those children." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, giving her a gentle hug that she returned without hesitation. The next morning Margaret woke to an unusual sound. It started as a distant rumble, similar to the night before, but this time it was much, much louder. She wrapped her robe around herself and walked to the front door, completely unprepared for what she was about to see. Her driveway, her front yard, and the entire stretch of road in front of her property were lined with motorcycles. Not 15 this time, over 100. Hell's Angels from chapters across Colorado, Wyoming, and even as far as California had ridden through the night to get there. Big Joe stood at the front of the pack, grinning. Behind him, the bikers were unloading their motorcycles, lumber, tools, paint, roofing materials, and more supplies than Margaret could identify. "We made some calls last night after we left," Joe explained. "We noticed your roof has some damage, your porch is sagging, and that fence out back is barely standing. We figured it's the least we can do." Before Margaret could protest, the bikers had organized into work crews. Some tackled the roof, others reinforced the porch, and a team started rebuilding the fence. A group of the club's women members, who had arrived in trucks, started cleaning gutters and touching up paint. Someone even began fixing the squeaky gate that had been driving Margaret crazy for 2 years. The local news got wind of the story, and by afternoon cameras were rolling as commentators tried to make sense of the scene. A kind elderly woman and an army of bikers working in perfect harmony. The story went viral within hours. Strangers from across the country began sending donations to Margaret, which she promptly redirected to the Hells Angels charity organizations. By the end of the weekend, Margaret's property looked better than it had in decades. But more than that, she'd gained a family. The bikers adopted her as their honorary grandmother, visiting regularly, helping with heavy chores, and including her in their charity events. She became a fixture at their toy drives, sitting proudly on the back of Big Joe's bike, waving at astonished onlookers. When Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep 4 years later at the age of 77, over 300 Hells Angels attended her funeral. They served as pallbearers. They donated to the scholarship fund established in her name, and they made sure that her legacy of kindness, of seeing people rather than stereotypes, lived on. The story of the night Margaret Henderson opened her door to strangers in a storm became legend in biker communities across the country. It's told around campfires and clubhouses, a reminder that humanity can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections are forged in the most unlikely circumstances. Her farmhouse still stands, now maintained by the very same motorcycle club she sheltered that snowy night. A plaque by the front door reads, "Home of Margaret Henderson, who taught us that family isn't always about blood, it's about who's willing to open their door when the storm hits."